All right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to the Friends of the South Grey Museum Speaker Series. Thanks to the Friends, this amazing speaker series continues, and we are back with another great author, a great scientist, and an exceptional subject. As we begin this evening, we'd like to formally recognize that we are meeting on Anishinaabe traditional territory. Once again, thank you. Thank you and welcome, and thank you for continued support. To start off this evening, I'd like to quote a very famous Canadian poet, a raconteur, a philosopher, and his quote goes as follows. Well, the girls are out to bingo, and the boys are getting stinko. We think no more of Inco on a Sudbury Saturday night. The glasses they will tinkle, while our eyes, they are a twinkle. And we'll think no more of Inco on a Sudbury Saturday night. Stompin' Tom Connors wrote that song, a song which became the national or the city anthem of Sudbury. The song, which was released in 1969, reflects the stereotypical view that most Canadians had of that hard rock mining town and its neighbor, Copper Cliff. Some of us remember tourism in Sudbury in the 1960s and the 1970s. Tourism then consisted of going with your mom and dad or your family and taking a picture in front of the Big Nickel. That was erected in 1964 and was a commemorative for the 1951 anniversary of mining in the Sudbury Basin. And don't forget, at nighttime, what did you do? Well, you drove out towards the mines and you watched the molten slag being poured off the trams down the side of the hill. You spent the night, if you did spend the night, at the Canadiana Motel on the entrance, the end of Highway 69. It had a big totem pole in the front. Or, if you didn't want to go there, there was always the Ambassador Motel. One could always go to the Nickel Range. Now, people of my generation spent many a wasted evening in the Nickel Range Hotel. It's a place where miners really did get stinko and where the White Lightning Gang used to hang out. The Prospect Hotel was another favorite beer hall in Sudbury at the time. But mostly, Sudbury was the town you had to drive through if you were heading west from southern Ontario, up Highway 69. Don't forget the signs that said, "Don't pick up hitchhikers," near the Burwash prison. Through the middle of Sudbury, in traffic, across the tracks, and then head west on Highway 17, which eventually became Highway number 1 and is now, well, it's not now, but it became, at that time, it was a Trans-Canada Highway. Then starting in 1977, something began to change. The landscape of barren rock, which NASA, and this is a fact, used to study in preparation for the moon landings, began to turn green with vegetation. In June of 1984, the premier destinations of today's Sudbury, Science North and the Dynamic Earth opened. Fish began to appear in previously dead lakes like Lake Ramsey. I remember watching from Laurentian University. We spent time there as we were playing volleyball at a tournament and going out to the lake, and you could actually see the chemicals drifting up off the water. Sudbury was experiencing a rebirth. And in the middle of in the middle of all that, was our tonight's guest speaker. Franco Mariotti came to Canada at the ripe old age of 8 years. He lived in the Little Italy neighborhood of Copper Cliff, where he attended the local Copper Cliff High School. His dad was interested in birds, and maybe he instilled that interest in Franco. After graduating from Laurentian University with an honors degree in biology, he began volunteer work on the development of the Science Center and was one of the people whose boots were on the ground from the very beginning. As a staff scientist, he retired after 33 years as a blue coat, and that's the term they used for scientists who work in Science North because they wore blue coats. Interpreters, scientists, educators all played an important part at Science North. Currently, Franco lives in Whitefish, which is about a half an hour west of Sudbury, and it's on the old Highway 17. Whitefish used to be this first town about a half an hour west of Sudbury that you passed if you were heading further west. Among career highlights, his travels have taken him to many far-off places, including Tanzania, where he made an IMAX film on Dr. Jane Goodall, and to Borneo, where he filmed orangutans. Franco has a biography which is extensive. He's been a TED Talks presenter. He's been a Sudbury community. He's received the Sudbury Community Builders Award for Environmental Action. He's been a member of a Green Space Advisory Board, a World Wildlife Fund lecturer, a naturalist, a guide and a presenter on small expedition cruise ships through the Arctic Northwest Passage and also the Antarctic, as well as being involved and chairing numerous environmentally focused community groups and organizations. As a quick aside, Franco stated in one of his biographies or one of his comments that one of his favorite Science North experiences was raising Ralph the porcupine. Let me tell you about Ralph the porcupine. When my sons, who are now in their 40s, were about 8 or 9 or 10 years of age, we went to Science North. We went to the Dynamic Earth, and of course we took pictures in front of the Big Nickel. And we walked through the Science North exhibits. It's an amazing place. If you haven't been there, you have to go and see it. And suddenly we turned a corner, and there was a wall of odor that just about knocked us on our rear ends. And we wondered what it was. It smelled like somebody hadn't washed their armpits for 15 weeks or had been on a drive through the desert without any water. And it was Ralph the porcupine. And it was the stinkiest thing I'd ever smelt up until that point. And of course, the kids were oohing and awing, and I don't want to stand here, and it stinks, and what's that stinking, Dad? Do we have to stay here? Well, it was Ralph the porcupine. Another aside, Franco's also lectured on the weird mating habits of various animals. And apparently the porcupine, in order to pass his scent on to a prospective porcupine mate, urinates on her. And if she likes the smell, they will mate. If not, she shakes her tail and away she goes. Well, poor old Ralph was probably looking for a mate as he was urinating at the Science North exhibits. That was a weird aside, but I thought it was interesting. The kids loved it. Our son was supposed to be 6'5" tall, by the way. They had a measuring thing where you could jump up, and wherever you touched, that was your height. It turned out to be 6'4", so it was pretty darn close. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we welcome Franco Mariotti as he presents his speaker series presentation, Ontario's Unknown Bear. Franco.
Folks, it's an extreme pleasure, really is, to be here. What a great space. I don't think I've ever heard as a thorough biography of myself as that. Was that really me? No. When I was a young teenager, I became fascinated with Arctic tales of exploration. So much so that perhaps I became obsessed with reading books about Peary, Cook, all the other explorers right to this day. And I began to realize that if it was possible, I fell in love with the Arctic through the eyes of these explorers. Albeit, it became a very narrow view of the Arctic. Now when I look back, I looked at the Arctic back then as a stage, a platform, where humans can experience the full range of the human emotions. Endurance, weakness, courage, cowardice, life, death. And if you were to ask me back then, as so many people did, why would you ever want to go to the Arctic? I had an immediate answer: adventure. If you were to ask me now why I would go, I would give you a simpler and yet more profound answer. And that is, the reason I go to the Arctic, simply to see things I have never seen before. Think about it for a moment. Think about if I could show you something that is beyond the world of your own imagination. That's pretty exciting. So tonight, I'm not going to talk about the Arctic as a whole, but one special animal, but even a little bit more specific, one animal that most people don't even realize lives here in Ontario. And this title, Ontario's Unknown Bear, arises from personal experience. As so aptly put, I worked for Science North for so many years, and one of my favorite things was to walk over to the skeleton that was hanging from the ceiling and wait for people to come up, visitors. We start talking about the fin whale, a real fin whale skeleton. It was about 72 feet long. Was that 20 meters? And one of my favorite questions was, name me a whale that lives in Ontario. And 99% of the time, that would stop people dead in their tracks. And they would take, normally, 5 to 10 seconds to come back with a response. They literally would just stand there, thinking. You could see them thinking. Some people would say, ha, marine land. And then they would laugh because captive orcas in marine land, that's not really a wild animal. And then some would say, the Great Lakes. Oh, no, they catch themselves. The Great Lakes is fresh water. There's no whales in Great Lakes. And 15, 20 seconds into this conversation, some, not all, would start thinking northward, that Ontario has an Arctic environment. We have beluga whales, 50,000 of them, that travel along the coast of southern Hudson's Bay and James Bay. And with those whales on land and on winter ice, there are polar bears, there are walruses. It's a shame that we think southward all the time, where the power is. This province has an incredible diversity of life. And my role tonight is the hope to show you things at least, that you haven't seen before, and in that process, learn about things you've never heard about before. So this title of The Unknown Bear comes from exactly that experience at my Science North. So very briefly, what I'm going to cover is why we have polar bears in Ontario. Very brief. Let's get into the animal itself. What makes a polar bear a polar bear? How do you study polar bears? What is the evidence telling us that we've learned after 50 years of studying polar bears? And I'm going to finish off with changes. Some surprising changes that were never predicted. So you ready? Let's go. There's that unknown animal. You'll find out how many live in Ontario, by the way, as we go through this. You know, there are people who devote their entire lives and thousands of hours in the field studying these animals. I'm not one of them. So what makes me here to talk to you about polar bears any special? I'm a biologist, but I'm a science communicator. That was my job for 32 years at Science North. What's a science communicator? Think of a journalist who's writing about a story, has to do research, reference. My job as a science communicator was when we did presentations about Arctic animals, I was even part of a small team that created exhibits that traveled all over North America about the Arctic and polar bears. I talked to the specialists. I interviewed them. My job was to translate that academic language into a language we could all understand. That's what a science communicator does, and that's what I hope to do with this presentation also. So, oh, by the way, those are the three people that are primarily responsible for all of this information. Andy DeRoche is a recognized polar bear expert, 40 years plus studying polar bears out of the University of Alberta. Dr. Martin Hobart, some of you may know, Nancy knows this man. He's Ontario polar bear expert. He has studied polar bears in James Bay, Hudson's Bay. Nicholas, you don't know. He's a young PhD student mentored by Andy. But all these three have contributed through their research about what I'm going to talk to you about. So let's go. Why are polar bears even here? Look at the map of Canada. What defines the Arctic? Is it the Arctic Circle at 6 degrees latitude? Not really, because all that line does at the top of the world, you cross it, you have 24 hours of daylight in summer and 24 hours of darkness in winter. Below that, you don't have 24 hours either way. So all that line does is says certain times of the year, it's either totally light or totally dark. What's a better way of defining the Arctic? It's, Tim, I may have stuck. Oh, here we go. So the difference in color between the orange and the blue, the orange is a tree line. Above that, trees don't grow because you have permanently frozen ground. So all of this blue is permanent frozen ground or permafrost. And look at, it extends all the way to northern Ontario. That's why we have Arctic plants and Arctic animals living the north part of the province. Why is it this far south? Hudson's Bay, this massive inland sea, has a tendency of drawing cold air from the north and extending the permafrost line. That's why the polar bears are there. What makes a polar bear different from any other animal? Well, let's have a close look. By the way, this is the world's largest land carnivore. So I don't think you've ever heard the title in a tourist brochure, Ontario, home of the world's largest land carnivore. No, because we don't even think they're here. These are the three bears we do know of. Black bear on the left, these are average sizes. These are skulls. Grizzly or brown bear in the middle. And some grizzlies, like Kodiak Island in Alaska, get almost as big as polar bears. And there's the polar bear on the right. But a better way of comparing them is when you compare them side by side, standing up. And why am I using the grizzly? Not just because it's almost as big as the polar bear, but if you look at the genes, the genetics of these two animals, they shared a common ancestor 400,000 years ago. That's what the genes tell us. Some scientists argue that that split may have occurred as recent as 150,000 years ago. So they're really closely related. But let's look at the physical differences. A grizzly bear, when it's standing, 3 meters or about 10, 11 feet, so the head of a grizzly would be here, standing beside me. Polar bear, 4 meters or 12 feet, even taller, twice my height. That's where his head would be. That's a big animal. Weight-wise, on average, a grizzly 350 to 600 kilograms. That's about 1,500 pounds. A polar bear, up to 1,800 pounds. That's why it's the world's largest carnivore. If you look at their heads, there is a dramatic difference. Grizzlies have this pronounced forehead, very noticeable. Polar bears, no, not so much. Wedge-shaped. Why? A couple of reasons that we know of. Its behavior, one of the ways that it catches its food, which is seals, is by using its head as a wedge to punch through the snow, as deep as a meter at times, to get at the seal. If a grizzly bear tried to do that, you can get a headache because of that forehead. But even more amazing, if you look at the nose of a polar bear, it's really long compared to any other bear. Inside that nose is a sophisticated heat exchange system that warms the air before it gets to the lungs. What am I talking about? Male polar bears and non-pregnant female polar bears do not hibernate. That means in the dead of winter in the high Arctic, they can reach -70. -70, this bear is walking about, sucking in cold air. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever tried jogging in the wintertime here, on a really cold day, it really affects your lungs, and not in a good way. It could be very serious. What the bear has evolved is a very sophisticated system of thin bones, like radiator fins, that on a live animal are coated with arteries, so that as the cold air passes through, heat is exchanged from the arteries to the cold air, and by the time the air reaches the lungs, it's almost its body temperature. And one more thing. Behind that nose is one of the largest noses, or olfactory systems, as scientists call it, of any animal on the planet. A polar bear, and this has been done through studies by Ian Sterling, who's the father of polar bear research in Canada. He actually put out dead seals on the ice, and a polar bear can find a dead seal from 14+ kilometers away. And a live seal in a den through a meter of snow as far as 1 to 2 kilometers away. It can smell that. Bear with me here. So let's compare skulls. Polar bear on the right, they look very similar. They both have canines, very sharp, and both are used to grab and tear meat. But this is where the differences begin. Oh, gee, sorry. Let me go back a sec. Okay, let's leave it there. So you see the forehead differences, but look at the circle, which looks at the molars. The grizzly is flat, pretty similar to your molars. We use them to grind. So do grizzlies. They're omnivorous. They love to dig into the ground, chew roots, eat insects, and they grind them up. If they come across meat, like a dead moose, or sometimes even a live moose, they'll use their incisors. But on the polar bear, I don't know if you can see this, they're not flat. The molars overlap like a scissor cutting meat. This is strictly a carnivorous animal, not omnivorous. The claws, grizzlies have incredible length of claws. Being omnivorous, they dig through the ground for roots and insects. Those claws can be almost 14 centimeters, 6 inches long. But in a polar bear, they're shorter and curled. They're only about half the length, but notice that curl. That curl is there for several reasons. One of them is grip on the ice when it walks on the ice, and polar bears walk on a lot of ice. But most importantly, to grab seals out of the water and bring them in and tear them apart. That's what those claws are for. I love this picture. It reminds me of the Muppets. That's a researcher's foot on the left. That's a sleeping polar bear. Well, when I say sleeping, darted, so it's out for about 45 minutes. But notice the size of the foot. They're like snowshoes. It makes sense. This is an animal that spends most of the year on snow. But if you turn that foot over, it's got little stipules, where if you look at a grizzly or a black bear, it's smooth pads. The polar bear has these little tiny stipules or bumps to act like the grips on a snow tire, so they don't slide on ice. It's a beautiful adaptation to a cold environment. People call the polar bear the white bear. That's a misnomer. It doesn't have any white. It does not have the color pigment of white. Black bears are black because inside their hairs they have a black pigment. Grizzlies are brown because inside their hairs, they have a brown pigment. Polar bears have olive hairs, and they appear white only because the light reflected through the hairs coming back to us show us the color of white of the rainbow. But it's not a real white color. Someone suggested perhaps we should call it the translucent bear. I like the name ephemeral myself. Sort of appears out of the whiteness and disappears again. If you look at the hairs, that's really close-ups of the hollow hairs, and you cut one across the diameter, it's hollow. A few decades ago, some biologists came up with the idea, you know why? Because these hairs act like a fiber optic cord directing light from outside down to warm the skin. As romantic as that is, that's what that is. It's romantic. Never been proven. But what we do know is that those hairs disperse the light as soon as it hits the fur and is absorbed by the black skin. Grizzlies and black bears don't have black skin. Only polar bears do. And for the longest time, we weren't really sure why would it have black skin. It's hidden by the white fur. Well, we think the UV radiation from the sun's light can penetrate that fur and be absorbed. So again, a beautiful adaptation. But let's take a close look at the skin. This is not real, by the way. It's a nice, sophisticated digital drawing. You have the long guard hairs up on top. This is what keeps the water away from the skin, right? Keeps the bear warm when it's on land. Beneath that long guard hairs are fine, feathery fur. Fine, feathery fur. Let's try that. Here we go. You don't see that unless you actually pull the head apart, and I don't suggest that doing that with a live bear. And beneath that, you have the black skin, but beneath the skin, you have the fat. It's not blubber like in a whale, but it is fat. Almost 10 centimeters of it, 4 inches of fat. When a polar bear dives into the water, this is what keeps it warm, not the fur in the water. Another big thing, grizzly bears hibernate, just like black bears, both male and female. In polar bears, only pregnant females hibernate, which means that they will dig a den, this is in northern James Bay, through usually a gravel pile or a sphagnum pile of permafrost, and this is where they'll have their young. But all males and non-pregnant females remain active throughout the winter. And that's really important, trying to understand their lifestyle. So how do you study the world's largest carnivore? Bear with me here. Here we go. This is a typical environment shot where a polar bear lives. How do you follow it? In the summer, you'd need a ship. Too expensive for researchers, just out of the question. And besides, a ship would be so intrusive, you'll never be able to study its natural behavior. The ideal way would be skis. Snowmobiles could work, but again, too noisy, it would disturb the animal too much. Skis and snowshoes would be the ideal, but I propose to you that if you do try to study polar bears that way, polar bear researchers themselves would be an endangered species. Remember, you're dealing with the world's largest carnivore, and it preys on people. No ifs or buts. I wanted you to meet Dr. Martin Hobart, Ontario's polar bear guy. He's the one on the left. He's been studying them on and off in James Bay for the last almost 20 years. So let's follow Marty to the James Bay lowlands to see how they study polar bears. And by the way, as you can tell by this picture, it's flat. What you're seeing is an M&R helicopter, and what you're not seeing, there's a gentleman hanging out the door with a tranquilizer gun. His job is to follow a polar bear with a helicopter, tranquilize that bear, in other words, put it to sleep. Now, you think, when you watch this in documentaries, it's an easy thing to do. Nothing could be farther from the truth. First, you put too much tranquilizer in that dart, you'll kill the bear. I don't know if any of you have ever talked to a polar bear researcher. They just don't look at these animals as data points for the research. Every single polar bear researcher I've ever met have such a reverence for their animals. The least thing they want to do is hurt these animals. Right? If you put too little tranquilizer, this bear will revive while you're measuring it. Not a good thing. So you've got to estimate from the air, and it takes an experienced biologist to do this, how much tranquilizer to put it down. So they were successful, they went down. By the way, one person approaches while a second has a rifle at hand, prods the bear with a long stick to make sure it is down. It takes about 20 minutes after it's been darted. And what they're doing, what they're doing is taking different measurements to see how healthy the bear is. And I'll join you here. So this bear is sleeping for about 45 minutes, and in that time, they have to do a whole series of measurements like this. By the way, that man is not sleeping, he's just lying down. This was an 1,100-pound polar bear, one of the biggest they've come across in that area. And one of the things they do is there's a little tooth behind the lower incisor that is called vestigial. For those of you who don't know what the word means, vestigial is something in an organism that is on its way out evolutionary-wise. This tooth is so small that it has no function any longer. But to a polar bear biologist, they removed the tooth, cut it in half, and you could age it precisely. So if this bear was 7.5 years old, 10.5, 15.5, or 1 year old, they would know exactly by that tooth. Really important. They then take fat samples. And you know why? The fat samples could tell them if there's any PCBs or lead in the fat, and there is, because they accumulate through the food web from fish to seals to them. But most importantly, the fat, I love this, tells them exactly what they eat. Fat from seals that they eat is deposited directly into their fat, so they know if this bear has been eating ring seal, bearded seal, or harp seal. That's how important it is, right? So they now know that 80 to 90% of the polar bear diet is ringed seal. You'll see what one looks like shortly. So there's the fat sample taken back to the lab and analyzed. They also weigh the bear. So on average, what does a 5-year-old bear, male bear, weigh? They'll know after capturing so many, right? So they're beginning to determine what is considered healthy for a 4-year-old bear, 8-year-old bear, 12-year-old bear. All of this is done in a hurry. They measure the girth. They measure from nose to tail. Has a little short tail. And again, it's related to the age of the bear. All of this is referred to as body mass. So when you look at the body mass of an animal, the figure you finally have will tell you if the bear is healthy or not, depending on its body mass. You with me? Last thing, they want to follow, where does this bear go in the wintertime? Because remember, if you're in the high Arctic, it's 24 hours of darkness. Even if you could afford a helicopter every day, how would you follow it, right? And expensive as heck. So the collar, Marty could be sitting back in his office in Peterborough and follow that bear every hour or every 6 hours or every 24. They set it throughout the next year. Knows exactly where that bear is. The GPS collars. Each collar is worth $3,000 to $5,000 US. They're supposed to last 2 years. Sometimes they only last a few months. Sometimes the researcher's lucky, 1.5 years. So they could follow the bear through the winter, through the summer when they're on land, and back onto the ice. That's what a collar looks like. But that's not the last thing they do. They put a little plastic tag, a number on the year. This is much more permanent. The collar will come off after, when the battery stops, The researchers will go back and remove the collar. Sometimes they get broken off by the bear. These are protected by the ear and will last almost to the end of their life. So how do we know that number? When they're hunted. Cree in the James Bay area traditionally hunt polar bears, and in the far north, the Inuit do. They have for millennia. So when they get a bear that has a tag, they report it in to the biologist. From that, they can determine a population that is sustainable to hunt. Very, very important. Very last thing they do, they tattoo the upper lip on the inside. That too can only be seen if the bear is dead or tranquilized. Right? You don't do that with live bear. Well, I'm almost lying. The very last thing is this. It's a water-based paint that's sprayed on the back of the bear so that when they release it and they're flying around for the next few weeks, they want to know, if we caught that bear, is it worth pursuing? And as soon as they see the red dot, no, it's not worth pursuing because we've already tranquilized that bear or put a collar on, right? So that way you're not wasting gas going after a bear that you've already seen. That paint will wash off in about 4 to 6 weeks. What do we know about bears? Studying them for so many years. Well, we know that worldwide, only in the northern hemisphere, of course, there's no polar bears in Antarctica, contrary to what Coke makes you believe. In the northern hemisphere, there are 19 subpopulations. This is Ontario. We are the most southern population of polar bears in the world. These are all the same species. So why 19 population? What determines that? Is it a political thing? No. By the way, before I move on, take a look at this. Newfoundland is considered within the range of polar bears. For those of you who've been to Newfoundland, you do not find polar bears in Newfoundland. Well, that's not totally correct. Almost every spring, polar bears will come down with the ice off of Labrador, and some of them do land in Newfoundland. But the Newfoundland government has a policy of tranquilizing the bears and flying them back to Labrador. They used to shoot them, but polar bears are a very sensitive population. Shooting them is a tremendous waste, not only for the species, but to have a sustainable hunt for up north. So, 19 worldwide, that's the best figure. So about 26,000 polar bears exist. That's the best figure we know. That's done by aerial surveys. Canada is home to 65% of the world's population of polar bears. This is home turf for polar bears. So let's focus in on our bears here in Ontario. First of all, why that funny boundary? Well, biologists put that red boundary around the southern Hudson's Bay, the Ontario polar bears, because if you look at the movements of several bears here, they stay primarily within that red boundary. So that is their home range. Their population belongs here, the southern Hudson Bay. And if you look at where they've been captured, right along the coast, southern Hudson's Bay and James Bay. And the beautiful thing about this is, and the nice thing, that most of those bears are found here. There's the range, but within the boundaries of Polar Bear Provincial Park. So a lot of their habitat is protected. Awesome. There it is there. I'm going to show you now a map showing movements of 4 bears specifically, but I'm only going to focus on one bear. So let your eyes adjust to these different points. We're going to follow the bear that has the red triangle. Here he is here, right? You can make your way through. The other bears are the green bear, the orange bear, the brown bear. Those are individuals. But note, September to June, 9 months. Well, what's that? Maybe 10 months, depending when in June. So it began on September 7th when the ice is not in. There's open water in James Bay. This animal, after it was collared, began walking along the coast. And then when the ice came in November, it walked out onto the ice, went over the Quebec side, way back to the center of Hudson's Bay, back. Now, what kind of distance are we talking about? Look at the bottom left. That's 200 kilometers. That's 200 kilometers. 200, 400, 600, 800, 1,000, 1,200, 1,400. This bear, by the time it made its way back to land, probably covered 3,000 to 4,000 kilometers. But this is just in a 10-month period. These animals move. Some of their territories are half the size of Saskatchewan. Hard to follow one individually on land. The Western Hudson Bay population, where Churchill, Manitoba is, this is why that is a subpopulation. All of these bears go out onto the ice in winter and come back. A few move in with the James Bay population, but that's just a few. If you look at where Churchill is, it's right on the point of a peninsula, and that's where the bears gather at the end of every summer, waiting for the ice to show up. They're the closest at that point, that geographical location, they're the closest to the ice. They're waiting. And that's why Churchill is the polar bear capital of the world. The longest polar bear study comes from Churchill, almost 50 years and going right now. That's where we know most about polar bears. So what have we learned about the life of a polar bear? If we look at the two southern populations, Manitoba and Ontario, summer when there's no ice, the bears are on land because they cannot catch seals in the water. They're very slow swimmers, right? So they walk around. They survive off their fat. They can catch the odd egg from a nest, eat the odd berry. Nothing replaces the fat of the seal. So they rely on their fat, and you know how much they use? Anywhere between 1 kilogram to 2 kilograms of fat per day. Got that? So imagine a large adult male polar bear, 15 years old. In a month, it would have used 60 kilograms of fat to wait out the ice returning. Okay? But they actually wait even longer because the normal period is longer. So they actually stand around. Sometimes they sleep, not hibernate. Biologists used to call this a standing hibernation. It's a misnomer because they're not really hibernating. They're not collecting urine in their bodies like real hibernating bears do. They just wait around. If they're lucky, they can get a dead beluga or a dead seal, but that's rare, right? I'll talk a little bit more. But this is where they become active. As the ice returns in the fall and winter and spring, that's where they want to be, because that is where the ring seals are, their food. And they roam continuously. If there's a bad storm, they might hunker down in a snowbank, create a den for a few days, but then they're off again. Can you see that bear? There it is. This is off of Baffin Island. This is their food, the ring seal. That's an adult. Adult seals learn very quickly, let's say about 7, 8, 9 months, to avoid bears. Up to that time, they're naive as heck. They don't know what a bear is, and they fall prey to polar bears. So let's just see what bears do in the fall. The ice is forming. The bears don't want to wait until it's solid. They'll go out swimming from ice floe to ice floe. And their tactic is sneak up behind the seal on the ice floe, leap out of the water, try to grab the seal. They're as successful at getting a seal as a lion is to a wildebeest, but once every 7, 8 times. Sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. Really hard. But wintertime, when it's solid ice, the seals have to make breathing holes. The bears find these breathing holes and they wait. They wait for the seal to come up for air, and they'll get one. Again, the odds don't become increasingly more, maybe 1 in 5. But the real period is when the seals give birth to their young in dens. That's where the polar bears gain the most fat, is in March and April when the young ringed seals are born. This is the idyllic drawing of a seal den. So the adult seal comes from underneath the ice in the hole. This is a snowdrift. The pup is there. The pup is totally naive, right? But the mother will be right by that hole in case a polar bear comes. That's what a young pup looks like through a hole in the den. Our researchers probably dug the hole to get at this picture. And this is a picture, look below here. This is the snowdrift. Clearly a hole that was made by the polar bear, wedged its head in. The blood tells us it was successful. And if you look at the outside, Arctic fox prints, Arctic foxes and ivory gulls have picked up the remaining scraps. Arctic foxes actually follow polar bears in the wintertime, and they survive by the scraps that polar bears provide them in the ice. So what's all this evidence telling us? What's happening? Satellite imagery tells us about ice pretty accurately since 1980. So when is the most sea ice in the Arctic? It's March. The ice builds up through the winter, and the most ice in the Arctic is in March. So last year, this past winter, March 7th has the day that had the most ice. But look, you see an orange line? From 1980 to 2010, 30-year period, ice was pretty steady. That's where the ice should be on that date for every March 7th going back. It's less than traditionally we've seen. So when is, that circle you could see, Hudson James Bay, totally covered over by ice in wintertime. That's why the James Bay and polar bear and James Bay and Churchill bears are out on the ice. The least ice occurs in September of every year. So this September is not over yet. We don't know if there's still ice melting. We have to wait until this month is over. But last year, it occurred on September 18th, least ice. Look at the line. For 30 years, 1980 to 2010, that's the least ice days. We've lost hundreds of thousands of kilometers of ice. Think about it for a minute. You have an animal that depends on ice to feed. That's where its food is. Now there's less ice. What does that mean? It's losing its grocery store, to put it simply. But let's not leave September yet. The most recent data I could get was from last week. Oh, by the way, in summer, Hudson James Bay, totally clear, right? So the most recent is from a week ago. Look at this. All of this ice loss from 30 years. Let's compare this to last September. Pretty similar, but less ice. Look, this was the least ice all of last year, and already, it's not even the 18th of September, we have less ice than least ice from last year. The ice is accelerating. It's melting more and more each year. I want to diverge. Just give me a couple of minutes to talk about ice. Right? We tend to look at ice as an inanimate object, not living. A couple of things we really have to look at again. When light hits white objects, it reflects. And when it comes to ice, 15% is absorbed by the ice. 85% bounces off back into the atmosphere. That's when it hits ice. What happens when it hits a dark color like open water? 93% gets absorbed. Only 7% bounces back. What's happening to all that heat? It's warming up the water quicker. The more open water, the more ice melt. It's a terrible feedback system. So you can't gradually expect ice to melt at the same rate every year. It's going to accelerate because the more open water, the quicker the Arctic Ocean is going to warm up. Only 7% reflects back from open water. Okay, let's look at that ice again. I apologize here, this is giving me a little bit of trouble. Here we go. So we know polar bears use ice. We know that Inuit use ice as the main form of travel. We'd be making a tremendous mistake to look at ice simply as that, and this is why. In the last few decades, biologists have discovered that underneath that ice, algae grows. Ice created in one winter is about 1 meter thick. Light can still penetrate through, and the bottom of the ice becomes a platform for algae to grow. Interesting. Little creatures, a little bit bigger, called copepods and amphipods. They look a bit like tiny shrimp. They're called insects of the sea. They feed on the phytoplankton, on the algae. For the amphipods, they convert the carbohydrate from the phytoplankton into 70% fat in their bodies. That becomes a pretty delicious little tidbit for our animals. Arctic cod. Unlike Newfoundland cod that we would eat on our plate, Arctic cod is only about 10, 12 centimeters long, no bigger. But they can live in cracks in the ice because they have antifreeze in their system and they can experience below freezing temperatures. But they eat all of these little tiny creatures. And any creature above an Arctic cod eats it. So they transfer, this is an amazing figure, 90% of the energy from the lower food web up to the higher animals. So what eats Arctic cod? All of these. From thick-billed murres to bearded seals, narwhal, belugas, so on. Of course, bowhead whales. There's a simple food web, and it's all dependent on the cod, and they would not be there if it wasn't for the algae underneath the ice. This is a romantic poster of that food web, which ultimately leads to the top of the food chain, which is the polar bear, right? All there because of the algae growing underneath the ice. So that ice is no longer just a platform, but as someone said, ice in the Arctic is like soil in a forest. Absolutely crucial for the ecosystem. Further, what's the evidence telling us? And there's some changes happening, some of which we weren't able to predict. Some we did. So, the length of the ice free, when people started studying polar bears in Churchill back in 1979, the ice free season, well, that's a little bit slow, but it was 3 months. And then the ice came back. So back then, 40 years ago, polar bears had to rely on their fat for 3 months of the year. Now, as of 2022, that ice-free season is no longer 3 months. It's 4 months. So what's the implications? They're using up more fat before the ice comes back so they could get feed. So that means their quality of health isn't as prime as what it used to be. What are the ramifications? Well, body mass in polar bears now in the two areas is less than what it was 40 years ago. Their bodies are literally smaller, less fat, for one. As far as births, in Churchill, 3 cubs used to be common because they were healthy animals 40 years ago. Now, the average, 2.5, which simply means they're seeing 2 cubs much more than 3 cubs. Now you say, oh, we still have polar bears around. Yeah, think about, let's keep going. What about if that ice-free season goes to 5 months? What happens to their body mass? What happens to the cubs? Everything's going down, right? It doesn't take a biologist or a scientist to realize what's happening with polar bears. Let's look at the numbers. These are based on aerial surveys. In 1987, in Churchill, 1,185 bears. That's the best estimate. 2011, 250 or so less. 2 years ago, less than half. What about Ontario? 1980, when the first survey was ever done of polar bears in James Bay, and that wasn't thorough, but the estimate was 950 bears, a little bit less than what Churchill had. 30 years later, that number had not changed. After this year, we started seeing reduced body mass, reduced cubs, so that the last, most accurate in 2016, that's what we're down to. Not as dramatic as Churchill, but you can see where this is going. What about worldwide? How are they doing worldwide? So Polar Bear International, which is made up of the world's top-notch polar bear experts, there's 19 populations. They know of only 8 accurately. The most southern populations, so this is, right, northern Ontario, Hudson's Bay, Beaufort Sea, North Shore of Alaska, populations are dropping. Yellow, stable. Green, 2 places, only 2 subpopulations have increased numbers. We're not sure. It could be more floating ice, which means more platforms for the seal to go on and more captures. Could be. But 10, unknown. All of Russia, we don't know. These areas do not have thorough studies, so we're only guessing. So let me remind you, let's go through quickly from the bottom to the top. In the summertime, the bears are forced on land because there's no ice. They can't eat, so they're surviving on their fat. This is August in Churchill. This is August off of Baffin Island. Same time, right? Look at all that ice coming down from Greenland and Ellesmere. So the further north you go, the more ice. More ice, more seals. And shortly after we saw these 2 ringed seals, we saw this, a polar bear with a seal. So this is 50 kilometers off the coast of Baffin Island. Let's have a closer look at this guy. I'd say he's doing not too badly. In fact, biologists have determined an index by looking at a bear, how well it's doing. Very skinny, very fat. And if you look at this guy, in August, when the Churchill bears are living out their fat, this guy is doing very well catching seals because there's still a lot of ice up north. The further north you go, the more ice. In fact, bears off of northern Baffin and Ellesmere are on the ice year-round. There is no time on land because there's always ice up there, right? So somewhere there's a transition. Right now, the Baffin bears are doing okay. Look at this mom with 1-year-olds. They're in great shape. This is again in August. 50 kilometers of land, we came across a mother polar bear with 3 cubs swimming behind her. 50 kilometers off land. There was ice floes, but quite a few kilometers away, which begs the question. We know bears could swim, polar bears. How far? So biologists in Alaska collared polar bears to see how far they would go to swim out to the ice. One more picture, I think, of the mom with the 3 bears. Doing very well, right? 3 cubs. That's its maximum. This is the North Shore of Alaska, 10 or 12 collared bears, and the bears didn't wait until the ice came back in November. They began swimming out to it. 220 miles, which is what? About 360 kilometers? Let me see. 352 kilometers. That's how far they swam. You know what? That's not the record. Just before I retired, we heard of an Alaskan biologist who tracked the bear swimming at a record distance. I phoned them and got the story directly from them. And it was reported in many science journals, but including The Guardian. There's a mother bear with a cub. She swam for 9 days, 687 kilometers to reach the ice. She lost her cub and lost 20% of her body weight. So when we speak of changes in the Arctic, is this an extreme example, or is this going to become more common as ice becomes less and less? We don't know the answer to that, but it will come at a cost the further they have to swim. Some changes were totally unpredictable. Anybody recognize what that is? That is a hybrid cross between a grizzly bear and a polar bear called a growler. Since 2006, Since 2006, 9 hybrids have been found. And if we go back just quickly to what that bear looked like, I want to point it out to you. The difference is slightly off-white generally, a ring around the eyes, claws that are somewhere between a grizzly and a polar bear in length. Some fur that is brown is not hollow, the white fur is. Totally hybrid. But until 2015, biologists thought this was a dead end. In other words, they thought that a polar bear crossing with a grizzly is like a donkey crossing with a horse. You get a mule that most of the time is infertile, dead end, not going to go anywhere. Until 2015. That year, this bear came out of hibernation way up here on Banks Island and encountered a female polar bear that was in heat. And if you look at this map of grizzlies in North America, that is the density there, that is the new expansion range. Grizzlies are now found in the high Arctic islands, crossing, overlapping the range of polar bears. They mated. You can see that's a hybrid. You want to see what the offspring looks like? So this is 50% polar bear, 50% grizzly that mated with a full grizzly, producing, suspense is building, these are 3/4 grizzly, and she's 50% polar bear, 50% grizzly. Some people said, well, this is the new face of polar bears as climate change is occurring. Whoa, stop right there. Foreheads, brown fur. Will the environment, as winter approaches, tell the bear to hibernate? Remember, non-pregnant female bears don't. Grizzlies do. So as the mother leads them out onto the ice, what's going to happen to them? So I'm the least person to put human words to an animal, but I'm thinking here of a humorous situation, so bear with me. So you have this vision of a hybrid polar bear walking out into the ice as the sun is setting on the horizon, and these 3 brown cubs following her, and one of them says, Mom, I'm getting sleepy. And she turns around and she says, oh, you're just like your father. This is the ice in 2050. My sons, if they want to see real full-fledged polar bears, this is where they'll be. Northern Ellesmere, northern Greenland. Why? Look at the ocean currents. It's called the last ice. If you look at the currents, they come in through, water comes in through the North Pacific, through the Bering Strait, into the Arctic Ocean, goes in a clockwise formation around the Arctic, and exits out through Svalbard to the north, Greenland, and Baffin to the south. All of the existing ice gets pushed up against the land in the high Arctic. What about beyond 2050? I haven't met a biologist who wants to talk about that. It's a little bit of hope. There are pockets in the high Arctic where those animals that are stuck on land can actually get decent food. One of them is here, up in Lancaster Sound at a place called Conningham Bay or Inlet. We visited this bay. The island, which is Prince of Wales, is very shallow, no hills. It's a huge limestone island. And the bay has got a narrow opening to the sea, and it's very shallow. And belugas love to come here with their young ones. In fact, it's kindergarten school for baby belugas. Those are Zodiac boats that we use to go out. You can see there's a young beluga right there, a couple of adults, a couple of adult belugas looking after 50, 60 baby belugas. Historically, some of these belugas get trapped as the tide goes down, and polar bears will pick them off. In the last few hundred years, Inuit come here to hunt belugas, and they leave carcasses. There's a young one. And those carcasses that are left behind by the Inuit are scavenged by the polar bears that have learned to expect belugas. So for hundreds of years, the polar bears have been coming here in the summer when they normally don't eat very much. And you tell me if they're going to head into winter. Look at the size of this bear. He's licking his chops here. Look at that. You want to put the body fat index? Very fat. He's going to go into winter doing really well. And this is a 6-month polar bear cub. When the adults have fed, they don't come down as groups. Adults, the strongest ones, will eat first, and so on down the pecking order. This guy came down when just about hardly anything left, but enough blubber and intestine for him to eat. And he's actually doing, body-wise, not too bad for a 6-month-old cub. I doubt if he's on his own, his mother would be somewhere nearby, probably sleeping off what she's been eating. So there are pockets like this here and there through the Arctic where you might have isolated pockets where some populations of polar bears may do not too bad. There's a new National Marine Protected Area being proposed for Northern Ontario. It's huge. All of southern Hudson's Bay and all of western James Bay. It's awesome. That means that habitat here will be protected. The Inuit and the Cree can still hunt, but of course, sustainably. So that's good news. That's really good news. There's also a new science. People find, and rightfully so, collars on bears very intrusive to the animals. In fact, some even question ethically whether biologists should be doing that. But until recently, there was no other way we could follow their movements, right? So they've been valuable. But now, there's this thing called environmental DNA. And all the biologists, now it's literally just beginning with polar bears. You scrape the snow in the footprint of the polar bear that went by, and in that snow, there's a few cells that have come off the bear's foot. With the DNA analysis from that snow, they could identify individual bears. They could identify if it's a male or a female. What is hoped is that by looking at the isotopes from that foot, we might be able to tell where the bear came from, because you may not always be able to follow the tracks. This is a whole new science, and people are hoping that if we take it further, we may not need the collars anymore. I have to talk about this. We may think polar bears are on another planet. They're not. They're in our home province. And what's happening to them, you all know, it's through our actions, climate change. You know, it's not rocket science. We can all reduce our footprint. You know, what do I mean by that? I'm not saying go out, sell your car tomorrow, become totally vegan. All I'm saying is be cautious what you buy. Do you really need to buy? Every time you take something off the shelf, it's replaced. It's eating into resources, creating a larger carbon footprint. I'm not here to tell you what to do. These are suggested solutions that are not rocket science. Think globally, act locally. We've heard that phrase when I was a kid. What do we mean? There are community groups you could join that are doing great things like reforestation. We know that planting trees is one of the best mitigating things we can do to prevent climate change. So help, go out and plant trees with your local groups. Support organizations that work in the Arctic or do great environmental work, and these are just 3. Right? World Wildlife Fund, we've all heard that. Ontario Nature, Jane Goodall Institute, these are great organizations where most of your money goes directly to actually helping out great projects. Lastly, we know darn well that some politicians don't listen. We just have to keep pushing them. If you're wondering, it'll never work, look how far we've come with electric vehicles. 15 years ago, I don't know about you, but people were pretty pessimistic that we could convert over to electric vehicles. Now, you can't buy enough of them. You can't keep up. We're getting there, right? So we can just keep pushing the people that make the decisions what the right thing is. But I want to leave you with some good stuff. Here's an animal that is a terrestrial animal, a bear, that over hundreds of thousands of years has learned to go into a marine environment and become the top predator of a marine environment. We may think because we use things like GPS and now environmental DNA, there's nothing much more we can learn. That's not true. How does a mother polar bear teach her cubs how to hunt? What actually happens on a hunt, as an example? What happens when the weather is really severe? How does it dig its den? We can only make suppositions. Inuit tell stories of seeing polar bears stand up on their hind legs, carry chunks of ice, walk over to a seal den, and push the ice through the roof. They've even tell you stories of seeing polar bears push rocks over the edge of a cliff onto a colony of walrus down below. These are things that no collar or environmental DNA could ever teach us, except observation. But I want to leave you with one last mystery that as a biologist I'm fascinated with. Why does a totally white animal living in a totally white environment have a black nose? There's got to be an answer. There's somebody PhD. So folks, I think I talked long enough. Let's have some questions. Thank you very much. So, questions? Yes?
I'm curious, given that brown bears exist both in North America and Europe.
Yes. Grizzlies are also found in Siberia and Europe. Yeah.
And I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, like, do they not sort of allocate races to some of those populations?
Yeah.
Which are different from North American bears versus European bears?
Yeah. Some may even call it some subspecies, but in polar bears, there's no such thing as a subspecies in polar bear. But there is in brown bears, and there is in probably black bears. So, as an example, I look at black bears here in Northern Ontario. It's not unusual to find 400, 500-pound bear, or even 1,000. That's rare. That's a big black bear. My son works in Waterton National Park in southern Alberta. I saw a black bear that was no more than 80 pounds, and she was already a mother. Clearly, there's a smaller population of black bears elsewhere. Are they a subspecies? A race probably might be the more appropriate word, and that bear probably could mate easily with one of our black bears if the two ever come together. So species was supposed to define different animals. If you're this species, you cannot mate with another species. That was the definition. That's being thrown out the window, not only by what's happening with polar bears. The last few years in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, there's a narwhal that's been adopted by a pod of belugas. There has been, in the past, hybrids between narwhals and belugas. There's been hybrids between blue whales and fin whales. Do they go beyond that? We don't know. How do you then, one of them starts looking like the other, and that's hard to, you have to look at the genetics. So this whole idea of what makes a species or race or subspecies is still very much studied. By the way, you think a lot of you realize we have, all of us within us, Neanderthal DNA, very small percentage, but it's there. So somewhere in the past, we know we considered Neanderthals a different species, but somewhere in the past, there was a mating and was successful. It carried through because we have the genes. So life is weird and wonderful. And it makes us humble as to realize, oh my God, yeah, throw that out the window. Let's look at it a whole new way.
What about behavior? Like, are there populations in other parts of the polar region that have exclusive behavioral distinction?
Yeah, really good questions. So I'll give you two examples. In Labrador, there's a small population of polar bears that in the springtime, some of the rivers have salmon running up. And one small population of polar bears are learning to behave like grizzlies in Alaska and go after these salmon in the river. Unheard of anywhere else in the polar region. In southern Greenland, there's a population of polar bears that are living in mostly ice-free fjords, very tiny ranges. The seals are using freshwater ice to climb onto, and the polar bears are going after them and being quite successful, but that's only in that population. So behavior, it raises the question, do polar bears have a culture? Chimps have a culture. Some whale species have cultures. Things and behaviors that they pass on to their offspring. Do polar bears? That can be debated. It has to be studied more. But there's signs that there are definitely different races of animals and possibly races of polar bears that behave differently than their counterparts in another environment. It's not a clear answer that I'm giving you, but these options are a reality and need to be studied further to give you a specific answer. Some people say there's enough time for polar bears to totally switch to a land diet. You talk to Andy de Rocher from Alberta, says birds' eggs, even catching live birds, a snow goose in the nest, nowhere gives you the amount of calories that a seal can give you. So don't ever think that those land animals, there's even been one example of a polar bear hunting down a caribou in the water. He was successful, but that's one incident, right? So the premise by most biologists is these are outliers. These are just rare examples of bears trying to eat something else, but that's not going to save the species. Oh, and will they become growlers? You talk to Marty, he says, there's no way. There's so few hybrids been found, 9. In 26,000 polar bears, there's so few, they're not going to replace an entire species. And if all that ice disappears 30 plus years, so there's a lot of answers yet to. My whole point of giving this presentation is not to be a downer. We have such incredible life forms to learn from, and in some cases in our own backyards. We need to learn about them, and once we learn about them, some of you know, we can try and understand them, and through that understanding, there grows an appreciation of what we're a part of. That's what we're after. That's what we should be after if we're going to survive into the future ourselves as a species. We're just sharing this planet with everything else. We're not the only species on this planet, and we got to stop behaving as if we are. That was, by the way, a bumper sticker I saw.
Does the Canadian government do any research with Svalbard?
Svalbard belongs to Norway. Andy from University of Alberta shares and has traveled wide, even Marty. A lot of polar bear researchers have traveled widely beyond Canada to learn about other populations, so that is shared work. But Svalbard belongs to Norway, and it's primarily the Norwegians who own the data for the polar bear populations up there. And Svalbard is loaded with polar bears.
Are polar bears territorial? So you showed us 4 bears, and obviously moving amongst each territory, but do they tend to stay
Yeah, I know what you mean. So what you're asking is, do they actually have a set territory? Even though we know it's so large, do they protect it from other bears? The answer seems to be no. And they don't mark their territory like a wolf would, for example, right? Or even a beaver would. Beavers and wolves literally stake out, this is my home, this is where my food is, I'm going to protect this from any other animals, any other beavers or any other wolves. Bears do not do that, but they don't like each other's companies. Polar bears, males, are notorious for killing cubs. Not their own, but other polar bear cubs. But so are all the bears. Marty's work and the man before him, they studied black bears before. There's a high number of male bears killing young cubs that are not theirs. Lions do that. A lot of the mammal carnivores have that behavior. You know, as humans, we kind of tend to put right and wrong with it, but it's not a right or wrong thing. It's an adaptation to that species that obviously has some benefits. Going back to your question, no, polar bears do not show a specific sign that they have protected habitat. They're free-ranging, following wherever their nose takes them.
And how many babies need to be born to a mom to maintain the population?
How many babies need to be born to a mom to maintain the population? It depends on environmental factors, how severe the weather or the climate may have been, the ice conditions. A mother with 1 cub who's a really good mother can raise that cub to be very successful, to become sexually mature and then reproduce. That's really all it takes. I don't think there's an average number that says you need 1.5 or 2. But clearly, as we're seeing less cubs over the years, that doesn't bode well, especially with the amount of body mass decreasing. Remember, a young male going into winter, or a male going into winter with reduced fat may not be so terrible because he'll go after the seals. But a mother who has a 1-year-old cubs, she's nursing, or was nursing, she needs all that fat. So for her to enter winter in a very poor state with 1-year-olds, that is not a good sign.
And are polar bears on the endangered species list?
So in the US, they are endangered. In Canada, they're considered vulnerable. So they're under the threatened species, vulnerable. The first part is least concern. That means we're not worried about it. Vulnerable means we got to keep an eye on this population. Threatened means, yeah, we got to start doing something to protect it. And endangered is the worst case, where it could become extinct if nothing is done. So in the US, they are considered endangered, but not in Canada.
And then in the Scandinavian countries?
In Svalbard, Norway is the only one that has polar bears. I don't believe they are, but assessments are taken very seriously because some Norwegians do hunt polar bears, of course. Yeah. So you want to know how many can we take, and you don't know that answer unless you know what the population is. So an accurate number and population. And you may wonder, how accurate is the numbers? The way they do it, as I said, is an aerial survey. So the way it's done, it's what's called mowing the lawn, where you take an aircraft at 500 feet, right, what's that, 150 meters, 2 observers in the front on either side of the airplane, 2 observers in the back, and there's a curtain that separates them. Because if somebody in the front gets excited, oh, a polar bear, it doesn't trigger the guy in the back. So I'll count that as 1. Can't do that. What they do is they fly a distance of so far inland, cut across 5 kilometers and back, just like you're mowing the lawn in a large scale. And at the end, when they land, the 2 different observers compare numbers and they take the average. And that's how it's determined. It's not perfect. That's why you saw that range of 22,000 to 31,000 polar bears. But it's the best they can do. And of course, nobody can walk on land and just cover every square foot. It's just physically impossible. But indigenous knowledge is incredibly important, right? If the Inuit are telling you there's more bears in the landscape the last few years, you better start paying attention, because they're the ones who are there all the time, even though they may not match, the aerial surveys. And that has happened. But then the 2 come together, the Inuit and the biologist, and hash out a number that they could hunt. And that's the way it's done. Yeah.
How old do polar bears live to be, and how many litters might a female polar bear?
Oh, excellent question. So a bear can have a young after 3, but normally it's 5 years old. And they'll have young every second year after that. They can live to 25. That's about the oldest wild bear we know of. And when they reach 20, they start having less of a litter, and maybe that might well be the last one they have. They may have another one, maybe 22, 23, maybe 1 cub. So maximum age 25, and they have a period of about 15 years where they can reproduce every second year. Some cubs last with the mom for 2.5, so that may push it to 3 years. So it depends. Some cubs stay with the mom only 1.5 years, but they need that time to learn to hunt. They absolutely must. Otherwise, they don't know how to. Yeah?
How's the food supply going? Are you bringing seals benefiting from the difficulties of the polar bear?
So far, there's still the ring seal numbers there. There's been some observations that seal are now in some places moving to land to have their young. That opens up a whole can of predators, wolves, that before may not have been, grizzly bears. In Svalbard, I don't know if any of you have, well, I'm sure you have, David Attenborough, BBC Wildlife Series. One that came out last year was photographed off of Svalbard. There's so much less snow in some parts of Svalbard now that there's no snow to build a den for the seal to have her young. So she's having it out in the open. And there was a scene where this pup, this little black speck out on the ice, was born. And there, off picture, comes a crouching polar bear and just picks it off. So there'll be more of that. If it continues, the seals will have to be forced on land to have their young, which opens them up to even more predation, not just by polar bears, by others. So, interesting. We're not seeing yet a major decline in ring seal populations yet, but there's always, just like the polar bears of 6-7 years ago, population was still high, but body mass is being reduced, litter is being reduced. So it'll take a few years for that to catch up. And the seals may be just that also. A few more years and might see less numbers. Yeah.
Are there any food sources at the bottom of the food web other than the phytoplanktons and the small critters that if we lose the ice will still support the fish populations and everything else, or is it just going to complete crash?
Excellent question. So you remove the soil in the forest, what have you got left? Can the trees grow? Can any other plants grow? You remove the ice, that whole food web changes. So the question then becomes, what are the cod going to feed on? Can phytoplankton, where the phytoplankton going to go if they can't grow underneath the ice? There may be some, I'm not a specialist at phytoplankton or zooplankton. There may be some that just grow in open water, probably is, and there may be some switching there, but I haven't come across any papers that describes an alternate food web in the future. We're just trying to understand what's going on now, let alone about, well, let's take these away and see what happens. I don't know. We don't know enough about what's there, really, other than superficially, these are the connections. It's an excellent question, and I don't think anybody could give you a clear answer.
Last question, Franco.
Sorry?
Last question.
Okay, last question. I have 2 questions. Okay. 2 questions. Two questions for this man.
The removal of the polar bears from the Labrador Island, is that just for human protection?
From Newfoundland?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that just for human protection, or what's the reason that they continue to keep them eradicated from that?
Yeah. There are people who live along the coast, as you know, of Newfoundland. I think people just don't want to deal with a predatory bear. You know, there are stories, if you read the articles even from just last winter, you know, a lady went in their backyard to hang up some laundry. Oh my God, there's a polar bear. You know. And depending on the intention of the polar bear, it's not a very good encounter, or it could be. So I don't think they simply have no tolerance. Iceland does exactly the same thing, except in Iceland, I think they may shoot them. They're not going to fly them to Greenland. That's much too far. So they used to shoot them, as I said, in Newfoundland, but now at least they know the populations, especially the Labrador population, and they fly them back and release them there. They're not going to swim back. Usually it's in the spring when the ice starts breaking up and they're there. They're an accidental passenger on this ice floe and heading that direction.
Speaking of ice flow, it's probably not scalable, but is there any idea that the possibility of creating like artificial ice sheets could be?
Well, you know, it's amazing what we could do. We could regreen Sudbury. Imagine, first of all, the sheer size of the landscape you're talking about. You know, and you just can't walk out into Labrador and say, oh, there's a polar bear. Walk 10 kilometers, there's another. You could go for weeks without ever seeing a polar bear. So how could you ever create artificial, you know, the seals would have to adopt it too. It would just be so much effort and cost. I think what you're describing is impossible. It's a bit like an example closer to home where our bats are dying of this fungus, the white nose. Well, people say, well, we have come up with a solution that kills the fungus. Great. How are you going to apply it? Well, go to every hibernaculum and paint the fungicide onto the bat? Physically impossible. You could do with a little small population, you know, then the amount of labor that takes, but to cover an entire species across so much areas, and we don't even know where all the hibernaculums are, like we don't know where all the polar bears are. So to create rafts, it would just be much too difficult. Yeah. Nice thought, though. Anyway, you could come and see me personally shortly. I just want to thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Franco. Franco will be here at the end of the presentation this evening, so if you have any further questions, I'm sure he'd be glad to answer them. I have the honor of thanking you for the presentation. I was enthralled. We were all enthralled. Thank you very much. Your presentation did indeed introduce us to Ontario's unknown bear. Thanks for the time that you took to come here from all the way from Whitefish. We appreciate that. And thanks for taking us on a trip to James Bay to find out more about a bear which a lot of us know very little about. We'd also like to thank you. Your enthusiasm, your presentation, your knowledge has added to our enthusiasm, our knowledge, and our future. There is hope, and we can help, and we thank you for all that and giving us the hope at the end, too. So let's give Franco a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Great presentation. My only encounter was with a black bear, and that was coming home from Sudbury. We used to travel out west all the time. And as a kid, I always had my nose at the window looking for deer and bear and moose. Never saw anything until about just before COVID. We were coming home from Saskatchewan and saw a black bear run in front of the car behind me and crashed. That's my only example and my only experience with black bears. And that was right outside of Sudbury, just south of Sudbury on the old 69. Ladies and gentlemen, it's almost time for tea and coffee and time to mingle. But for 2 lucky persons, there are 2 animal and wildlife related books which are going to serve as our draw prizes for tonight. So get your tickets out. And we'll ask Franco to come up, please, and draw the 2 tickets if you could. You have a choice of 2 books. One isn't about a polar bear, but it's about the world of the grizzly bear. And the second book is the Guinness Book of Animal Facts and Feats. So you first person who wins gets their choice, the second person gets the other one. The ticket numbers, the first one was, and thank you for drawing this, last 4 numbers, 3565. 3565, last 4 numbers. Oh, it's Mr. 2 questions. Thank you. Come on up. Thank you and congratulations. Our second winner, the last 4 numbers, 3567. 3567. Your winner at the back, come on up and get your book, please. Congratulations to our winners. The World of the Grizzly Bear. As always, we wish to sincerely acknowledge the support of this speaker series by the Municipality of Grey Highlands and the good folks here at Annesley United Church. We'd like to thank the Annesley Events Group Committee for putting together that amazing bear display in the hallway as you come in. Our additional thanks are extended to our much valued community partners, Stephen's Restaurant of Markdale and Highland Grounds of Flesherton. Thanks to all of our friends at the South Grey Museum, and to Barry and Jean for continuing the speaker series. And once more, a special tip of our hat to the man upstairs, and I mean the one at the machine, not the real man upstairs, our guru of technology, Tim Riley of Leaking Ambience Studios in Flesherton. Let's give them all a big round of applause, too. We would also like to remind you at this time, and I'm not sure if Tim has this up, the next speaker, there we are. Thank you. We'd like to remind you at this time to join us on Wednesday, October the 18th for the next program in this series. On that evening, we'll welcome female pilot Marilyn Dixon of Durham and her presentation about Vi Milstead, a World War II transportation pilot, female pilot who flew 47 different types of planes from Canada to distant air bases. Should be another interesting presentation. This is indeed another program to mark on your calendar. That's October the 18th, same place, same time. Once again, thanks to each and every one of you for your attendance tonight. My name is Terry Mokry. I'm your MC, and I wish you health and happiness until next time when we meet again. God bless, keep safe, and keep well.